I do worry that in our industry there can sometimes be a bias, unwitting even, towards conflict and combat and confrontation.
In a rare moment of cable news clarity, MSNBC's Mehdi Hasan called out the media's bias towards war. In this case, a constant push on the White House to escalate a war with Russia as opposed to pressuring them for diplomacy. So I have two clips to share. Here is the first.
I have to say, I watched some of Jen Psaki's White House press briefings on Ukraine this past week, and something stood out to me. Have a listen.
Is the White House, is the administration facilitating the transfer of S-300 anti-air missiles?
President Zelensky, in his remarks to Congress today, again made his request for a no-fly zone. He no doubt is aware of President Biden's position on that. Is there any scenario in which President Biden would change his mind?
Would a strike in Poland on supplies or anything really automatically be met with a military, a forceful response, or simply a conversation amongst allies about how to respond?
Of course, Eamon, those are all valid questions, but what's often missing from a lot of these press briefings are questions from reporters about diplomacy, about peace, about the prospects for negotiations. I do worry that in our industry there can sometimes be a bias, unwitting even, towards conflict and combat and confrontation, escalation. And we have an obligation, don't we, as journalists, Eamon, not only to ask about arms transfers and no-fly zones, but also about what this administration is doing to get a peace deal, to end the war and not just escalate it further.
No, I mean, you bring up an excellent point, and I've been looking at the sheer devastation in Mariupol and Kharkiv, and I was wondering whether the U.S. and the West's objectives at this stage should be about saving Ukraine and Ukrainian lives, or whether it's about defeating Russia. And as someone who has covered wars extensively, I can tell you that when you're on the ground, those losing loved ones and suffering, they usually want the fighting to stop before they think about larger geopolitical ramifications. And with every weapon we send to Ukraine, and with questions like those that we just heard there, we're, it seems to me, more focused on defeating Russia at this stage.
So I have a second clip coming up about a separate but related topic to this, also from the same segment here. But first, this is the first time I think I've seen an acknowledgement by the media, in particular by cable news, of this bias towards war. This is just the way they operate, generally, the way they think, who they have on. Often, you know, retired generals with a very particular perspective. Often people that are working for defense contractors. They're the ones that come in to discuss, and this is across the board, whether it's, you know, MSNBC, CNN, Fox News. That's who they view as the professional perspective in times like this. People that work for defense contractors, because that is how they operate. Instead of maybe thinking, hey, maybe we shouldn't keep pushing towards escalation. Maybe we shouldn't keep pushing towards war. Maybe diplomacy is the answer. The military-industrial complex has, I mean, this is part of it. The media is a part of it. And you see it on a consistent basis, which is why it is so rare and so refreshing to see this openly discussed in a rare moment like this on MSNBC. Before I get to the second clip, I just want to show you examples of this. So, I mean, last week, Ryan Grimm also pointed this out on Twitter. He's a reporter for The Intercept. And I'll link to this below the video. He has a 4-minute video of questions from the press here towards Jen Psaki. They are all pushing pushing the White House towards escalating with Russia, except for Ryan Grimm at the end. He comes in with a question about diplomacy. But everybody else here is pushing towards war. And then he had a second video the next day, saying it's even wilder. Another 3 minutes, the exact same thing, showing you this perspective. And look, I really don't think most of the media is aware of it, because it's the company they keep. It's what they are told is the correct way to view this issue. They grow up, they work in an environment where war is normalized, where it is, of course we should be escalating with Russia. It's all about beating Russia, as opposed to looking at civilians, maybe why a no-fly zone is not a good idea, as it would mean the U.S. shooting down Russian planes. There is a direct conflict there between two nuclear powers. Maybe you don't want that. Instead, it's this constant push towards, you know, putting more warplanes there. supporting with arms in any way the West can. And instead of actually looking at this issue as a way or looking at ways to de-escalate, they're always looking for ways to push for essentially to sell more arms. And more on this. I mean, I'm not going to read through these articles, but Intercept has a good piece on this. Cable news military experts are on the defense industry dole. Again, as I said, showing you why that perspective is often there. And this has been going on for a while. So I've discussed this topic before. Phil Donahue on his 2003 firing from MSNBC when Liberal Network couldn't tolerate anti-war voices. His show was canceled because he was against the Iraq War. And he was bringing on voices that were anti-war, anti-Bush. And this is open. I mean, there is a leaked in-house report so that Phil Donahue's show would present, quote, a difficult public face for NBC in a time of war. He seems to delight in presenting guests who are anti-war, anti-Bush, and skeptical of the administration's motives. The danger quickly averted was that the show could become a home for the liberal anti-war agenda at the same time that our competitors are waving the flag at every opportunity. So NBC was not looking at this as, hey, what is the right thing to do for the world, for society? They're looking at this as a way to present themselves as more patriotic by being more pro-war. So by tying those two things together, and this is not just a media issue, but a cultural issue, by looking at you know, being patriotic means you are for killing people, essentially. That's what these two perspectives have been, or these two identities have been tied together. If you're patriotic, then you're for killing. That's absurd, but that's how this has been presented for decades now, at least decades. Now, let me get to the second part of this clip, which, again, is similar in the topic, but a little different as it deals with sanctions.
On that note, I had Senator Ben Cardin on the show earlier from the Foreign Relations Committee, and I asked him, and I was pleased to hear him say that, yes, the United States would be up for rolling back sanctions. It's a conversation that needs to be happened based on Putin actually pulling out of Ukraine, which is important. But then when I asked him about the impact of sanctions on ordinary Russians, will that make them more nationalistic, more anti-Western? He simply said, well, that's the fault of Vladimir Putin. And it is, don't get me wrong, it is the fault of Vladimir Putin. But we have to think about the consequences of our actions. And as you say, is it just about defeating Russia, or is it about trying to get a durable peace on the ground, trying not to turn ordinary Russians against us? That would be the worst outcome. Yeah. If instead of toppling Putin, they are incited by Putin into more anti-Western, more nationalistic attitudes. And that's not to say that I'm opposed to sanctions on Russia. It's just something we have to consider.
Another refreshing discussion on cable news here. And usually it's Mehdi Hassan bringing these different perspectives, not really anybody else. But here you have him discussing the balancing act that is sanctions. So, you know, when it comes to sanctions on Putin, on the Russian government, on oligarchs, whatever, those, you know, we understand. But when it comes to sanctions that do hurt the average Russian, ones that are often struggling, the question is, does this really help anything? I mean, the thinking behind it is that it, you know, it facilitates an environment to maybe put pressure on Putin, but does Putin really care if his country, if his people are being hurt? I tend to think he doesn't, especially when his focus is on putting out propaganda and essentially brainwashing the population into loving him. So sanctions that hurt the average Russian, usually financially, have, I think, one of two outcomes generally. You have people in Russia who are already skeptical of Putin. They already, you know, don't support this invasion. So sanctions on that hurt them either doesn't change their opinions, or maybe it turns them into being a little more resentful towards the West. And then on the other hand, you have Russians who are taken in by Putin's propaganda, who are already brainwashed, and these sanctions are just going to further entrench them into supporting their leader. So ultimately, you know, this is a gray area. It's hard to know the benefit. It may help in some cases, it may hurt in other cases. Ultimately, I think sanctions that just strictly hurt the population, people, again, that are often already struggling, is not going to solve the problem, and largely does create resentment towards the West and doesn't help, especially hopefully at some point when we're coming out of this. If these people are already have these negative feelings towards the West, it's going to be tougher to change those minds after they have been hurt by sanctions that personally, affected them. But again, you may say, well, it's created an environment to put pressure on Putin. Maybe, but I tend to think he cares more about himself than anybody else. So in this case, I think it really depends on the case, on the leader, on the society that they are running. So it's, there's no clear answers here, obviously. But it's good to see these sorts of discussions on MSNBC, at least a bit of a different perspective than what people are normally used to.